Welcome back. You're watching The World This Week. With us, Anne Bagamurray of the International Herald Tribune, Craig Capidis, Paris-based reporter, also Anthony Bélanger of the Franco-German television channel Arte, and Alberto Romagnoli of Italian broadcaster Rai. Lots of our colleagues are in the Bosnian capital this Friday for the 20th anniversary of the start of the siege of Sarajevo, April the 5th, 1992. While rallying for a peaceful solution to Bosnia's independence from Yugoslavia, demonstrators shot dead. The next day, the EU recognizing Bosnia as an independent state. But over the next 4 years, over 11,000 civilians killed just in Sarajevo, Europe's bloodiest conflict since the Second World War. And it would take another 2 years and the bombing of the market in Sarajevo for NATO forces to step in and step up intervention and tip the scales.
First of all, nobody thought there would be a war. We all thought that all of this was some kind of skirmishing and so on. It's hard to believe that the war happened in Europe.
Unfortunately, I lost my son during this aggression on Bosnia and Herzegovina. I also lost my brother-in-law. My mother passed away. So for me, this is a very sad day.
Nobody won, people lost, and this is a great shame.
No one hated anyone. Nobody needed to go, and the war didn't need to happen. Bastards came to power, and people got killed. There's nothing else to be said.
The war didn't need to happen. Alberto Romagnoli, did you have the sense back then that the war didn't need to happen?
It's difficult to say. I think that it's true that nobody could imagine. I was there the first summer, 1992, and everybody was thinking this will last some weeks, and for sure will end before winter, because it was already cold and nobody could imagine to pass a winter without glasses at the window. And then they spent 1, 2, 3, 4 winters like this. So things can go really different from people, even on the field, can believe. This is one of the lessons of the Bosnian conflict.
Craig Capidis, you...
Yeah, I think at the beginning, the only people who knew that it was going to be a war, and an ugly one, and an ethnic cleansing were the Serbs. I think that's been proven over time. I always tend to look at the Bosnian conflict as part one that led into the Kosovo conflict. Perhaps it's unfair, or perhaps a bit inaccurate historically, to lump the two together, but I always have. And it was very clear after the disaster in Bosnia that the Serbs wanted to try and pull it off again.
We're going to be talking in a moment about how it relates to Syria. But before we do, we're talking, just to set it in context, we're talking about a country where there was a mosaic of people.
Yes.
And
like in Syria.
20 years on, those people are still divided to a certain degree.
Well, to tell you the truth, I just wanted to add something very quite personal. I was a very young journalist when that war was set in, and I was one of those very optimistic journalists who thought that in Europe war couldn't happen once again. You know, it was everything was fabulous. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, no dead people, the liberation of the Eastern Bloc without death. So it was a very, very sad lesson that in the very core of Europe, 200,000 people could die for nationalistic reasons. And it was one of my first geopolitical lessons to learn. And second of all, I've got a lot of friends who went there, journalist friends who went there, and to make their job. And what they were telling me when they came back from Bosnia or from Kosovo is that they employed exactly the same words that that they could have employed in other words in other wars in other parts of the world far away from us, in Africa, for example. The same horrors, the same people desperate, the same. So, for me, personally, it was really, really a very tough lesson to learn. Apart from that, I think it's a lesson that never have to be forgotten. That even in the most civilized part of the world, let's say that, even in the core of Europe, even 50 years after the Second World War, even after 20 million people dead, in the Second World War, something like that can happen 2 hours from Paris.
Anne Bagamarie?
What strikes me when I think back on the war in the former Yugoslavia is that it brings home the point that even if you do try to more closely economically integrate countries, which of course was the reason for the EU and its predecessor organizations, if these countries trade with each other, if their economies are dependent on each other, of course they won't go to war against each other. What nobody figured on is that within a country there would essentially be countries that could make war against each other. And then you add the whole combustible element of religious differences, which are not solved by blood conflict, and that's maybe something we can talk about with Syria. So those are arguments that just defy logic.
So when listening to what you're saying, we've got reasons to be pessimistic when it comes to Syria.
I think you do.
Oh, yeah,
I think there are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic.
Of course.
Yeah. And we can come on to that in a minute.
They don't have the European Union, if you want to. They don't have to come together or to find a solution out of themselves, out of their religion division or their ethnic division. In Yugoslavia, for instance, you still had that European dream that is coming true right now because Croatia is about to enter. So there was a solution out of that conflict, which is not the case in Syria because there is no solution out of the deadlock, out of the country.
If you were a Serb, they didn't call the place Byzantium for nothing. It was a very Byzantine place, and it remains a very Byzantine place. What Anne was saying is absolutely correct. It's religion, it's economics. In many instances in that area, I mean, people have done PhD theses on the reasons for this. But you try to put it in the Syrian context, it's completely different. It's completely different. It's a gossamer comparison. This was in our backyard in Bosnia and Kosovo, the whole Balkan mess. These people, if you go back,
and it took 4 years for those neighborhoods.
It took 4 years because no one really understood it. On the religious side, many people, for example, failed to understand, Balkan monarchism, which you can go and look up people at home and find out about that. They failed to understand the role of the Bosnian Church. They failed to understand that the Catholics and Orthodox who lived there for many years before the Turkish invasion actually became Muslim, so they didn't have to pay a certain poll tax, and the women remained Christians. So whereas if you look at Syria and the Arab world, yes, there are Christians in Syria. We all know this.
10% of the population.
Yeah, it's significant. It's a significant number, but the Muslims who I have met covering stories in the Middle East are completely different from any of the Muslims, including the imams, who I met while in the Balkan region. It was basically they were more secular there.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
All right,
so the theocracy was out.
We're looking. We were mentioning how it could be a long slog when it comes to Syria. There is a deadline coming up set by Kofi Annan, February 10th, for a pullback. Unfortunately, though, it's not looking good. At the Turkish border, Thursday night alone, more than 2,000 refugees crossing on foot from Syria. They're fleeing from the city of Idlib, its surroundings. This amid word of approaching Syrian army tanks. Syria, where once again, most of our information comes courtesy of amateur video footage. This is Der Balbe. It's a neighborhood of Homs, and this was a video that came into us in the agencies on Friday, again over the web, and it's not looking good for that April 10th deadline, is it, Alberto Romagnoli?
Well, what I found amazing that today there was a video of people shooting on a funeral. That was the same situation of Sarajevo. That gives the idea that there is no mercy there is no mercy in the war in general. But when you shoot at the people at the funeral, it means that you want really to offend them. You don't want to leave any time they can be quiet. And I found striking that it was the same situation of Bosnia, and then, as it was, my colleague was saying, we don't know enough about the country, about the relations.
It took the bombing of the Sarajevo market for the situation to change. What will be the tipping point in Syria?
That's difficult to say. From now, I mean, for example, the main city, Damascus, hasn't been really touched. I mean, the suburbs of Damascus has been partly touched by demonstrations, and then, but I suppose that the crucial problem would be with the upheaval of Damascus or Aleppo, the two main cities of the country. On the other hand, you cannot do anything. That's the point. I mean, first, because everybody's divided on that issue, and second, because there is no solution. First of all, there is no economic reason to intervene, like, for example, in Libya. So there is no plot about it. So let's stick to the fact. The fact is that you cannot do anything because, first of all, you've got a lot of countries all around who has no interest in the intervention. And second of all, because the international community is entirely divided on the subject. In the United Nations, amongst the friends of Syria, amongst even the opposition to the Ba'ath regime. So it's like waiting.
You think they're divided? You think they're divided, or are they just intransient that they don't care? Because
I don't think they don't care. No, it's not fair.
I believe they don't
care.
care because the one thing we did see in the Balkans is that people cared. You had the late Richard Holbrooke, one of the most brilliant diplomats of the 20th century. You had Clinton, like him or not, as a politician.
But you had also all the European powers. I mean, all the countries in Europe who didn't want to have that war in the midst of their own in their backyards.
You're
as you said
absolutely
yourself.
correct. But there, you could sense that there was care on the ground.
Yeah.
And I don't. I'm sorry. I don't see that. I just keep seeing Kofi Annan on TV going, "Please stop the shelling." It's become a parody, and of course we have to report it because that's what we do. This is what he's saying. Mm-hmm. But you have a criminal gang in power in Syria, and the only way to get rid of a criminal gang is you go in with a big stick.
That's one of the three options.
And that's what you do. Nothing else works.
And nobody's willing to do that.
Precisely.
No, because you've got three options. Do everything. So go for it, for example. Do nothing, which is basically what we're doing. Or do something, which is what Turkey wants to do. Turkey wants to do something. The rest of the world want to do nothing. And some, like you, wants to do everything. Is going
no, I don't want to do. I still think the Turks
and
are
I think
the
it's
key
going
to
to be
the
a
solution.
catastrophe.
The Turks' key to the story. Before we conclude, one final story. The 25-year sentence for the so-called merchant of death, 45-year-old Victor Bout, convicted of trying to sell up to $20 million in weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, to shoot down U.S. helicopters. This all after a sting operation in Bangkok. It involved U.S. agents posing as representatives of Colombia's FARC rebellion. Victor Bout's nearly two-decade run of selling weapons everywhere from Afghanistan to Angola. The stuff of Hollywood movies. In fact, it was a Hollywood movie.
There are over 550 million firearms in worldwide circulation. That's one firearm for every 12 people on the planet. The only question is, how do we arm the other 11?
Let's make Craig Capitas, the Nicolas Cage interpretation in that movie is what springs to people's minds. But the story of Victor Bout is just absolutely amazing. That this could go on for over 2 decades.
It's not amazing at all. This is the arms trade. This is how it works. No arms deal in the world goes down without the knowledge and at least backhand authorization of a government. You cannot buy any weapons on the open market unless you have what's called an end-user certificate, which is a document that's given by a government to go out and allows you to purchase major caches of weapons, whether it be from NATO when they have their annual fire sale or from an arms manufacturer down the street. Governments sell end-user certificates. You cannot move any weapons without it. And people like Victor have for years worked for the good guys and for the bad guys. That's the way the business works. And when
the Russian Foreign Ministry certainly thinks in that vein that he's a scapegoat. They reacted to express this Friday their displeasure with the verdict and the sentence.
Once again, we have to say that long before his sentence was pronounced, Victor Bout was declared by the authorities to be a merchant of death and practically an international terrorist, while the prosecution was based on an imaginary criminal intent.
An imaginary criminal intent, Anne Bagamari.
I'm not familiar enough with the case to be able to say whether the evidence against him was compelling, trumped up, or somewhere in between. I do know that, what do you expect the Russians to say? I mean, this is a big embarrassment to them. It's been an embarrassment over the course of the trial, the disclosures. Making an example of this man is not going to go down well with the authorities, and the Americans are not going to answer in a political fashion because it's the courts, it's the justice system.
And hammering home the point that Craig Kapidis was making, if you want to know who sells weapons around the world, well, look no further than the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council responsible for 85% of weapons sales between 2002 and 2009. Those figures courtesy of the Congressional Research Center in Washington. Look at that pie chart. It points out that most of those weapons are sold, by the way, that's who's selling. Most of those weapons, by the way, sold to developing nations. And it's not really an issue.
The sad thing about that is that every country has got his guy like that. You know, we've got in France 2 of those middlemen which are linked with the Sarkozy government, and they're absolutely necessary if you want to.
All right, so Victor Bout is not only Russian.
He's not only Russian. You've got Takadine is one of those, and he's French, or he's mid-Libyan, mid-French.
So
and every country has got his middleman to...
Everyone's got their Victor Bout.
Exactly.
We're going to leave it there. Anthony Bélanger, I want to thank you. I want to thank Anne Bagamari. I want to thank as well Alberto Romagnoli and Craig Kapidis. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.